Oh boy, I can't wait. It turns out socialism has worked.
Has never worked. It's become a truism repeated by right-wingers and people who just don't know much about political theory. It could be something someone tries to say when you tell them you voted for Bernie Sanders. Psh, Bernie Sanders, don't you know that socialism has never worked? Many don't know much about the history of socialism or even really understand what socialism actually is. They hear the word socialism and they think of authoritarian regimes like the Soviet Union or North Korea, or even worse, they might say, hey, socialism doesn't work when they're having a conversation about someone like Barack Obama, implying that Obama is himself a socialist. Now, it should go without saying that Obama is not a socialist, but this actually has to be explained to some people.
I wouldn't go so far as to say he's not a socialist. Um, I mean, he favors socialized education. Of course, by that degree, George Bush is also a socialist. He favors socialized roads. So I would say he's an advocate of the mixed market economy that includes some socialism and some capitalism. Of course, it all depends on how you want to define your terms. With socialism, you ask two socialists what the word means, you get three definitions. So
People, this is true regardless of whether you are for or against socialism or communism or capitalism or social democracy. I am not a socialist, but I can only understand that if I actually know what socialism is. So let's begin there. Defined by a textbook, socialism is the collective ownership of a society's means of production. Means of production could be non-human resources used to produce things of economic value like real estate or farmland, natural resources, equipment, buildings, infrastructure, roads, and collective ownership of these things, meaning workers or the public own them.
or the state.
Some define socialism as a system by which social equality can be achieved. In this broader way of thinking about it, socialism could mean any kind of socialistic philosophies or attitudes or tendencies, or a system that combines orthodox socialist practices with other constructs like capitalism. For instance, you could say that some Scandinavian countries are socialistic by modern standards, not because they have a system where the government or workers own everything, but because they have a system where there's a relatively greater amount of intervention by democratic government to protect socialistic ideals like.
I think it's more accurate to say that these are capitalist economies with welfare states, or highly advanced welfare states, perhaps.
Egalitarianism, civil rights, equal education, environmentalism, and the prevention of abuse by actors in the free market. These are capitalist societies, and they're definitely
What abuse?
not realizations of socialism as defined in a political science glossary, but these are manifestations of socialistic inclinations, especially when compared to what goes on in many other developed countries.
I like this Pacman guy. Seems like he knows what he's talking about.
Socialism is an extremely broad umbrella term to describe a wide range of political, social, and economic systems, movements, and ideas. Let's explore where socialism comes from, some of its variations, and how they functioned in society. Some elements of socialism have ancient roots. Ancient Buddhism taught that the individual and all other living beings are interconnected and interdependent, and that all humans should be treated equally and with kindness. People often draw parallels between socialism and Buddhism, and many say that Plato's Republic first articulated the notion of a socialist state, a state that aims to solve social problems by government action through higher taxes and redistribution of resources. There are lots of other aspects of Plato's Republic that don't at all align with modern socialism. Socialistic ideals are seen being portrayed in the Hebrew Bible, which in many places says that people should be treated equally and that we should be generous to the have-nots. The book of Leviticus says you shall not oppress or exploit your neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. Deuteronomy says God enacts justice for orphans and widows, and he loves immigrants, giving them food and clothing. That means you must also love immigrants because you were immigrants. Don't take advantage of poor or needy workers, whether they are fellow Israelites or immigrants who live in your land or your cities. From Ecclesiastes, it is God's gift to humankind that everyone should eat and drink. From Psalms, give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute, rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. Now, this might get awkward for anti-socialist
It's a few too many Bible quotes.
Christian conservatives, but the New Testament is also chock full of socialist themes. Jesus advocated that all people, including governments, should provide for the poor and distribute resources according to people's needs. Some quotes from the New Testament: all who believed were together and had all things in common, and they sold their possessions and goods and divided them among all men as every man had need. And the multitude of them that believed were of one heart and of one soul. Neither said any of them that aught of the things which he possessed was his own, but they had all things in common. If you would be perfect, go, sell what you possess and give to the poor. When you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. Distribution was made unto every man according as he had need. To take another religious example, in Zoroastrianism, the prophet Mazdak the Younger in 6th century Persia promoted the implementation of social welfare.
Zoroastrianism, also known as Mazdayasana and Bedin, is an Iranian religion and one of the world's oldest faiths.
Welfare institutions and collective ownership of property. Many ancient religions acknowledged the social nature of humans, whether on purpose or by accident, and promoted equality, caring for the needy, and common ownership. The term socialism itself wasn't used until the early 19th century in Western Europe by philosophers and social critics like Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, Henri de Saint-Simon, and Robert Owen. At first, the word was used not to describe any one political system, but as an abstraction, a philosophy that societies could or should operate to serve the collective, as opposed to just thinking about the individual. This was in the wake of the French Revolution, and in large part a reaction to the poverty and inequality that was growing out of the Industrial Revolution. And then over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, there were many, many different philosophies that branched out of this to form separate socialist intellectual movements. This is where the idea that socialism means any one thing is dispelled. When someone says socialism has never worked, be suspicious that they're thinking very narrowly and really not taking into account how many different types of socialism there really are and how different types of socialism have manifested, or they might just be completely clueless about history too. Many of the flavors of socialism have some overlap and aren't necessarily mutually exclusive movements. One of the first schools of
It's like the Hydra. Every head you chop down, three more pop up.
socialist thought was utopian socialism, which in itself is sort of an umbrella of different theories. But in this way of thinking, socialists have posed that capitalists, factory owners, and others would...
I mean, utopian socialism predates the factory system. In the English Civil War, you had the diggers and the ranters. They were Christian millennial communists, and they attempted to try a society with a common store of goods, the elimination of private property, and the common store of goods, and of course the result was disaster.
voluntarily hand over the means of production to workers. They believed that this would be accomplished by way of education and conversations between socialists and capitalists until all the means of production were controlled by the collective and decentralized democracies. Many utopian socialists drew from Christianity to form the rationales for their views. Utopian socialism has often been criticized for focusing too much on theoretical models of how the socialism might work and not enough on how it would be achieved, hence the name utopian. Then there's Marxism. Now, many people refer to Marxism colloquially as communism, even though communism can actually describe an array of different systems, some of which don't even involve a state.
Communism is itself utopian. Certainly Marxist communism is the notion that we live in some post-scarcity society and just frolic around doing whatever we want, living in abundance.
which I'll touch on in a second. But Marxism is definitely not merely synonymous with socialism the way many people think. Marxism is a type of socialism or a type of communism, something very specific. And it's not just an economic system, it's an entire philosophical worldview and a way of analyzing politics and society, economics, history, religion, art, whatever. And there is much, much more that can be explained about Marxism than I'm able to cover in this video. But as an ultra-simplified overview, political Marxism is centered around class struggle, revolution, and Marx's historical theory of materialism.
It's important to note that class struggle predated Marx. The original theorists who devised class struggle, Charles Comte and Dunoyer, were libertarians who correctly identified the struggle between those who would use political power to benefit themselves at the expense of others and those who were at the other end of that equation. So the struggle wasn't between the rich and the poor, but the economic class and the political class, or those favored by the political class.
Marxism advocates a revolution wherein a society's means of production are taken by force, rather than by reform or negotiation or slower forms of transition. The means of production will then be controlled by a proletarian state, which
the dictatorship of the proletariat,
in theory, will lead to an egalitarian, stateless society that governs itself without coercive institutions. Really important.
Highlight on in theory here, because once you establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, the vanguard class doesn't seem to want to give up their power anytime soon.
Point here. This is not what the Soviet Union or its, quote, communist successors achieved or were working toward, despite...
And yet, when the Soviet Union was established, and during its heyday, socialists around the world praised it.
Their pretenses, Bolshevism, Maoism, and the like, are inherently right-wing, totalitarian perversions of Marxism. In direct contrast to Marxism and other forms of state socialism is libertarian socialism, where there's...
Libertarian socialism is nonsense. There's no effort to solve the calculation problem. How are you going to determine how scarce resources should be allocated? There's no attempt to answer the question.
There's an emphasis on having a state that is either small and decentralized or completely non-existent. One version of libertarian socialism is anarchism.
It's interesting. I'd never heard of libertarian socialism that was not anarchism. I assumed it was all anarchist instead of, limited government?
It is a set of socialist movements that generally oppose the idea of hierarchies and authority altogether, especially the state. Really, no variation or stage.
I think Chomsky puts it very well when he says that libertarian socialism, under this system, any existing power structure or any exercise of power needs to justify itself. So, for example, if you have a child running out in the street, you're justified in using force and using power to restrain it, right? Because it's a young child, it doesn't realize it's going to get smoked by the car, and you're acting in its own interest. So that's an exercise of power, an exercise of authority, but it's one that is justified. And it's on the power structures to justify themselves, presumably. If they're collecting taxes, but that's going to free healthcare for everybody, that would be sort of justified because it's for the greater good under this auspice of libertarian socialism.
Of anarchism involves government by definition, and almost all schools of anarchism see any type of hierarchy as either unnecessary or unethical in any kind of human interaction, a boss at the workplace, a leader in a social movement, whatever the case may be. Now,
I mean, this is just absurd. We've always had leaders.
Within anarchism, there is anarchist communism, which seeks to abolish not only the state, but all markets, money, and private property in exchange for communal ownership of the means of production and decentralized grassroots direct democracies. There's anarcho-syndicalism, which can be thought of as a sort of extension of anarchist communism, where the means of production are controlled by confederated trade unions called syndicates. This type of anarchism actually manifests in Catalonia, Spain, right before World War II. In this instance, socialism worked.
It worked? Did it work for the thousands of people that were slaughtered for their political beliefs?
Almost all industries and aspects of the economy were collectivized without capitalism or money. Catalonia was able to provide quality health care for its 2.5 million inhabitants. Under anarcho-syndicalism, Catalonia saw a growth in wealth and production and absence of poverty. More schools.
Okay, they were around for like 6 months, and it was a crazy time. They slaughtered thousands of people for their political beliefs alone. They attacked churches.
Schools were built all around, objectively better public services were provided, and they had a highly effective military, which they constantly used to protect themselves against the Spanish nationalist forces during the Spanish Civil War. George Orwell described what he saw when he visited Catalonia in the 1930s. It was the first time I had ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle. This shows you what human beings are like when they are trying to behave as human beings and not as cogs in the capitalist machine. Anarcho-syndicalist communities also exist today in Chiapas, Mexico, which first developed in the 1990s education and healthcare services for themselves. They have sustainable and ecologically sound agricultural practices, which provide more than enough food, and they are champions of women's rights and the rights of indigenous Mexicans. And there are many other types of socialist anarchism. By the way, socialist anarchism should be redundant because things like anarcho-capitalism present oppressive economic hierarchies of authority that are inherently non-anarchistic. But with all of the ANCAPs running around on the internet these days, it's worth just clarifying that.
When anarcho-capitalists say they're anarchists, they just mean opposition to the state, not opposition to all forms of hierarchy. You can quibble about the definition if you want. Say we're not real anarchists. It's not an interesting argument to me. Technically, yeah, I suppose libertarians are, as Rothbard said, more middle of the roaders of the archy question. We do believe in rulers. We believe that every man should be the absolute ruler of his own home. Presumably, a lot of libertarian socialists believe that as well. So, it's really a semantic argument.
Point.
So, social democracy, it's really the core goals of social democracy are the same as that of revolutionary Marxism. They've just got a different approach. They're trying to implement incrementalism and achieve socialism through the ballot box instead of as a revolutionary struggle.
According to many, are even compatible with capitalism, or at least some elements of capitalism. In other words, in democratic socialism and social democracies, you can have markets, but the state provides a great deal of regulation and social welfare. Distinctions are sometimes made between democratic socialism and social democracy, in that democratic socialist states will ensure that major factions of industry are publicly owned, while social democracies tend to exist within more capitalist frameworks. Currently, no countries in the world really fit the description of democratic socialism. Venezuela under Hugo Chavez claimed to be democratic socialist, but it was, and still is by the way, just another right-wing, oppressive, authoritarian type.
How do these guys become right-wing when they implement every leftist policy, but they're right-wing simply because they're oppressive? I mean, the left-right spectrum is outdated to begin with, but clearly Chavez and Maduro, these guys are left-wing.
Of socialism. There are a handful of countries today that
It's like they define right wing as anything bad is right wing.
can be accurately described as social democracies. Modern social democracies allow egalitarianism, things like social welfare, universal health care, and representative democracy to flourish within the context of capitalism. Think of countries like Denmark, Finland, Norway, Iceland, Sweden. So modern social democracy is sometimes referred to as the Nordic model. These countries have free college, free graduate school, free or inexpensive world-class healthcare, paid through taxes. Compared to other developed countries, generally speaking, they have lower rates of crime.
So what's wrong with this so-called Nordic model? Doesn't it represent the best of both worlds, the wealth creation of capitalism with the redistribution effects of socialism? No, it's terrible. So first, let's address the fallacy of salvation through government spending. Government spending does not create prosperity. And the problem is that when it comes to government spending, we have the tendency to see only the seen, not the unseen. So you see the hospital that was built or the new road that was built, but you don't see the factory that wasn't built because of the taxes that paid for the government spending in the first place. So while government spending will create some jobs and some economic activity over here, it's also going to destroy some jobs and suppress some economic activity over there. Maybe the government can borrow the money, in which case that's just going to be paid back in taxes down the road, and at the same time, often this debt is going to end up being monetized, so you pay the price in inflation. Let's look at some welfare state policies like the minimum wage. Minimum wage sounds like a good idea. Why wouldn't you want people to have higher wages? The problem is the impact is purely prohibitory. So instead of raising anybody's wages, all it does is prohibit people from being employed at a sub-minimum wage rate. And if your skill set is worth less than the minimum wage, it means you won't be able to find work. Okay, what about welfare? Well, the problem with welfare is, what about the moral hazard? Okay, you got an alcoholic, he's drinking his life away, and he uses his welfare check to buy more alcohol. You're not doing that guy any favors. You're certainly not doing the taxpayer any favors. And you think it's better with alcohol than drugs. It's much worse. People are using their welfare check. And you see this in all the time. People are using the welfare check to buy drugs, and obviously that's not a good use of taxpayer money. And to the extent that you're just prolonging the addiction by allowing them access to drugs, you're making it worse. And a lot of people are now dependent upon welfare. They could work, but they don't. They just receive their welfare check and they live off that. So you're creating this dependent class that doesn't work, that lives off the taxes of people who do work, and that supports welfare state politicians because their livelihood literally depends upon it. In Ontario, we've got welfare, and then we've got disability, and there's a whole lot of disabled people, many of whom are not actually disabled. Or maybe they are disabled, but they could still work. They just choose not to. So welfare, you're basically paying people not to work. You're encouraging them to be idle, to be reliant upon the government. Healthcare and education, well, these are easy ones, okay? You've got a socialist monopoly. That's going to result in inferior quality and higher costs for education and for healthcare. Much better just to have markets. Likewise with unemployment insurance, right? That's going to encourage people to they get laid off, to take their time and milk that unemployment insurance for as much as possible before returning to work. Some people do that. They go basically the max allowed, then suddenly they can find a job as soon as the EI runs out. The reality is that a strict market economy, laissez-faire capitalism, works way better than the Nordic state model. Creates way more wealth, skyrocketing standards of living for the poor, and every time this system has been attempted, it's worked way better than the Nordic model. The Nordic model's not that good.
Socialism has been used to solve economic problems for millennia. in a wide variety of places and in different forms. Sumeria, circa 2100 BC, had a state-planned economy. Food was directly distributed through the state. Evidence of their bureaucracies can be found written on tens of thousands of clay tablets that were excavated in modern-day Iraq. The code of...
I don't think there's any academic consensus about this. For example, Svita von Redden in The Ancient Economy in Ptolemaic Egypt said, the transformation of a system into one based on coinage and contract, however, was not achieved by force and centralization as previous scholars had argued. Rather, it was a system carefully devised as a balance of state and local power, rural patronage, and private initiative, as well as indigenous agrarian patterns and Greek innovation. So I think that academic consensus is probably, if it ever was, in that manner, saying that there was a centralized economy, shifting away from that towards a more nuanced viewpoint.
From 323 to 30 BC, the state controlled the means of production and every aspect of commerce. The government owned all of the land and decided what crops should be grown and where. It controlled the mines, the paper, textiles, and...
Again, this is factually untrue. There was private ownership of land. An estimated 30 to 50% of farmland in Ptolemaic Egypt was owned directly by the crown. Then the temple, so they owned a lot of land. The temple owned some land as well. But there's apparently some very clear evidence of private land ownership also.
In the society collectively organized every aspect of agriculture, labor, trade, and transportation, and a census kept track of materials, individuals, and income. The Incan people graciously participated in this system in exchange for security and food, and it worked despite the massive size of the Incan territory, and it only fell apart because of the arrival of the Spanish in 1533. Responding to someone claiming that socialism has never worked, I would remind them that to the extent that socialism has been tried, where ideas and tendencies of democratic, egalitarian, left-wing socialism have been woven into political and economic life and haven't been nullified by right-wing phenomena like totalitarianism, police states, and oligarchy, the results have been good. The right-wing or conservative or classical liberal dogma in the U.S. is that higher taxes and a strong public sector are just awful. They say these things inhibit economic growth and innovation, or that the welfare state and thorough regulation of markets is unsustainable.
In terms of regulation, if you look at the origin of regulation in the during the so-called progressive era, what you see is established business interests were lobbying for regulations because the imposition of high fixed costs on a given industry was a good means of crushing their competitors. So markets don't need regulation. Markets are self-regulating. Consumers, as well as downstream providers, retail stores, they're all going to be evaluating for quality and cost. You don't need government intervention in the economy. Absolutely, high taxes and government spending, high government spending is bad for the economy, bad for economic growth, bad for society at large.
Endanger individual liberty. As progressives, we know that's not true, or really anyone who looks at the data or has studied truly democratic applications of socialism would know that's not true. Look at Scandinavian countries today, or even countries like France, Ireland, Canada, and New Zealand, which share some of the same characteristics.
All countries with high levels of economic freedom.
No matter what lens you look at these systems through, they are the best game in town. And again, these are capitalist societies, but they borrow from socialism. In terms of economics, the
wealthy in spite of their welfare states, not because of them.
These countries see economic growth at higher rates, lower unemployment, higher rates of job creation, better productivity per work hour, lower poverty, less homelessness. In terms of social issues, there's greater gender equality, better education equality, more social mobility, better healthcare, better quality of life in general. Socialism doesn't necessarily mean Marxism or communism, and it doesn't have to mean abandoning things like individual rights. Entire branches of socialism are centered around...
However you slice it, socialism is a bad idea. What we really need is freedom. capitalism. Markets, individual rights, not government control, not a nanny state, not a welfare state, not wealth redistribution, and certainly not state ownership of the means of production or worker ownership of the means of production. Capitalism is the greatest wealth generation engine the world has ever known. It works, and socialism does not.
Around individualism as their highest value. In many of its manifestations, socialism just means allowing government to more efficiently do what we already called upon it to do.
I mean, and with this nebulous definition of socialism, anything could be socialism. It's meaningless.
Protect people's rights, protect people from abuses of the free market, and provide social safety nets.
And the reason why socialists have to use this slippery language where nothing means anything is because if you actually hold their system to objective standards, then you realize how flawed it is. Yes, the Soviet Union was socialist. No, the Nordic system is not socialist. These are capitalist countries with a welfare state. That's not socialism. That's still private ownership of the means of production. So it's absurd. But the truth is, all the real experiments in socialism, the Soviet Union and Cuba, these all failed horribly. So now they got to come up with these post hoc explanations for why that wasn't really socialism, that was actually state capitalism. And it's just apologetics to the extreme, when in reality, socialists championed these systems when they were put in place. They championed them throughout their existence. It was only when the abuses, the totalitarian abuses of the socialist regimes became too horrible for anyone to deny, that they came up with this copium of, oh, well, that's not really socialism, that's communism, when before socialism and communism had been used interchangeably. And now they're trying to separate and distance themselves from these systems because they failed so horribly. But in reality, that is their system. The Soviet Union, Cuba, Khmer Rouge, and Cambodia, China, I mean, that is what they're advocating for.
And neither I nor any other reasonable person want to achieve those things through the power of one authoritarian person or small group of people. It should be done democratically through representative government or genuine communal ownership, like it's done in every place on earth where socialism has worked. Socialism combined with democratic values, which countries like the U.S. in principle hold dear, can give us something.
Democracy is just two wolves and a lamb deciding what's for dinner.
Liberty
is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote.
In terms of preventing the working class from being exploited by the rich and corporations,
Workers aren't exploited by businesses. They offer them mutually beneficial exchanges. That's not exploitation, that's opportunity.
Devastating wealth inequality, and providing basic human needs like healthcare and education. Many other societies have shown us that these things can be accomplished without anything reminiscent of the extreme examples often pointed to for people to claim that socialism doesn't work.
Nonsense. Just nonsense.